problem on matters housing, Mr. Speaker. We also visited other counties, Mr. Speaker, which ordinarily people would imagine that they don't need housing, Mr. Speaker, like Turkana, Wajir, and Narok and Kajiado, Mr. Speaker. But in all our visits, Mr. Speaker, people want houses. Mr. Speaker, under Article 43B of our Constitution, Mr. Speaker, obliges the government to ensure that it creates a situation where its citizens access affordable housing, among other recommendations that goes with the affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, it is our responsibility also as a house, as parliament, to ensure that we actualize Article 43 of our Constitution. And in that process, Mr. Speaker, we undertook to listen after looking at the bill and listen to the people of this republic. Mr. Speaker, in our findings, when we went around the country, Mr. Speaker, among the many issues which people raised was that they really want these houses. But how will they access these houses, Mr. Speaker? Equally so that not other people are prejudiced or not other people are disadvantaged. Mr. Speaker, the other question which people raised also, Mr. Speaker, is how do we build these houses? There was the question of voluntary contribution, Mr. Speaker, among the people we met. There were the questions of compulsory or voluntary and of course, a contribution that is forced. Mr. Speaker, we also listened to people who talked about how do we levy everybody, Mr. Speaker. Remember when the courts ruled? The courts ruled on the fact that there was no legal framework in place that will ensure the collection of levies was made equal so that it is not discriminatory, it touches on everybody. And these are the questions we also took. These are the questions which most of the members of the public came to ask. How is the levy going to be undertaken? Mr. Speaker, most touching was the areas that we visited, especially the slums of this country, Mr. Speaker. And in the slum areas, Mr. Speaker, people live in deplorable conditions, which every Kenyan who think this particular bill of housing is not necessary, you will need to visit those particular areas. I visited those areas myself, for the first time in some other areas, for the second time in some other areas, and we realized that people need houses. The only problem is accessing these particular houses. We even visit the Maasai areas where people wanted houses that are actually the model of manyatas. We visited Turkana, Mr. Speaker, where people wanted houses, the model of how Turkana live in those houses. We visited areas like Tana River, Mr. Speaker, where we had floods. And people think these houses come in handy to ensure that the people who are affected by floods, they called it cluster. Mr. Speaker, I also accorded the opportunity of having these particular houses. So, Mr. Speaker, I do not want to belabor much on these particular issues, but my submissions, Mr. Speaker, is number one, how do we make these houses accessible? How do we, or how does the government build these houses? Mr. Speaker, on the question of levies, people introduced many other aspects to the collection of levies. Some wanted levies to be collected and, of course, at the end of it should accrue benefits. Some made proposals to the extent that it should behave like the NSSF model, where after at the end of your retirement, you can still access that amount of money. There are so many proposals which people made, Mr. Speaker. And it is upon this House, Mr. Speaker, to make recommendations and, in the end, to do amendments on areas where they think fits to be done. Mr. Speaker, in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, proposes the formation of a board And in that aspect, Mr. Speaker, many people also were asking, after collection of this money, Mr. Speaker, how is it going to be managed? How is it going to be implemented? How